deaths of 4 people and the amputation of the survivor's left leg.
The attacks ended shortly after a great white was killed, with human remains in its belly. The panic that ensued during those 2 weeks would later inspire the movie Jaws.
White shark's population was decimated in the mid-70s after the release of Jaws.
Another fatal attack in 1936 would cement the monster's fearsome reputation.
Joseph Troy was a boy from Dorchester. He went down to Mattapoisett, and he was visiting his uncle. And Troy was out swimming in the afternoon with a Walter Stiles, and they were off of Hollywood Beach in Mattapoisett. And around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a shark appeared right next to Troy and grabbed him by his left leg, pulled him under. Stiles kept diving down trying to get Troy, but he couldn't. But Troy popped to the surface in a big pool of blood. When they got him ashore, they shipped him off, and he went to St. Luke's Hospital, and they ended up amputating his leg, and he passed away. Troy was 16 years old.
Today, the shark population is rebounding, and these beasts may be returning to coastlines and public beaches.
What I remember the most is that big eye.
Joe Fitzpack, a Massachusetts boat captain, was on a fishing excursion 2 miles out of Chatham Port when something almost attacked him.
We had 2 fish on, 2 nice fish on, and as I was watching the one in the back being fought, somebody yelled out, the girl yelled out in the front, what was that? And I kind of looked, and all I could see was like a dorsal fin into the water.
Something grabbed the line and ran with it.
Then all of a sudden the line went limp, and when she reeled it in, all I had left was the head.
Then they realized something was under the boat.
As it went underneath the boat, it made a big circle around and came up, and it started bumping the boat.
The shark hit the boat repeatedly. Then, after a few hard impacts, the water went quiet.
As I was picking it up on the side of the boat, the shark came right up from underneath. That's when I noticed that it was a great white. I could see the big black eye. His lips were kind of pulled back, so you could see the shape of the teeth. From the head where he was and to the back of the boat was 14 feet. The shark came right up from underneath, grabbed the whole of the fish and just stripped the whole innards and stuff right out of it, and all I had left in my hand was the head of that fish. He was probably 18 inches away from my hand.
The close encounter still haunts Fitzpack today.
I'll never forget how close I was to, really the working end of a great white shark.
It's a needle in a haystack here.
The search off the coast of Cape Cod is proving difficult.
We got birds, we got calm weather, we got a great slick, and we got nothing as far as sharks are concerned. I don't think there are a lot of white sharks. If there were, I would have tagged a lot of them by now. I've got 22 years in the business trying to tag a white shark, and I haven't yet.
The light is fading.
My opinion is we move the operation north. Tomorrow's a new day. We're going to head up to Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary. It's a protected, beautiful, productive bank that rises up from several hundred feet to within 90 feet of the surface. We got, some reports in the last few days of large fish hanging out in the area, large sharks in particular. It's just the player didn't show.
Monster Quest is searching the United States coastal waters for killer great white sharks. New research suggests that these monsters stalk their prey, strategizing before striking, with the premeditation and precision of a human serial killer.
Sharks are actually learning where the best hunting spots are.
Shark researcher Dr. Neil Hammerschlag has spent the last 8 years studying the attack strategies of great whites in the waters around Seal Island, South Africa.
The sharks are picking their hunting spots, camouflaged against the bottom through deep, dark, murky water, peering up to spot the silhouette of a seal against the water surface. This anchor point was not where the sharks had the highest chance of intercepting their seal prey, but instead was some sort of an optimal balance where sharks could detect prey, remain undetected by the seals, and even avoid competition with other sharks.
Hammerschlag calls these optimal stalking territories the underwater equivalent of dark alleys.
They're using some underwater alleys and using the underwater bottom topography to hide from or sneak up.
Using criminal profiling methods, Hammerschlag has tracked these beasts and identified the stalking areas around the island. Like human serial killers, the great white thrives in shadow.
We use a technique called geographic profiling, which uses the link sites of where attacks take place, usually criminal attacks on people, and plug it into this mathematical program called geographic profiling that uses the linked locations in this very fancy mathematical model, which determines where the highest probability of that criminal who perpetrates the attack is actually stationed themselves. Sharks and serial killers are obviously very different. They have a different motive, but basically they're using complex, similar underlying hunting strategies, which is the need to encounter their prey, avoid competitors, avoid being detected, and the need to use the underwater highways and other things, and that there's some linkages between their attacks.
Attacks that demonstrate the deadly efficiency of these killing machines.
The sharks are hunting primarily under low light conditions, like during dawn and dusk. And during times where it was overcast that day, they increased their hunting activity.
It is these shadowy conditions that give the great white its greatest success rate.
In comparison to the lion, the king of the jungle has a success rate normally of about 12%, that's pretty good. But on average, the great white sharks at Seal Island have a success rate of almost 48%. And during low light conditions, they have success rates as high as 55%. That's over more than half of their attempts are successful. What we found has never been shown before is that when their success rate drops to about 40% at high light levels, they just stop hunting. So they actually know to stop hunting when the chances of them making a successful kill is low. Other animals would just keep hunting and, failing, but the sharks actually stop when their chances of actually making a successful kill is dropped.
The great white targets vulnerable victims, the weakest of which can be maneuvered and isolated for slaughter.
They'll let different seal groups pass by, older seals, and in a big group of seals of different ages, sometimes the younger ones can't swim as well and they start trailing off the back end of the group. The sharks notice it right away, they isolate that seal, and they launch their attack on that animal.
The great white favors the blitz technique used by human serial killers like Jack the Ripper. Attacks so quick and brutal that the victim has no time to react.
The sharks start tracking the seal's movement, monitoring the seal's breathing, and trying to anticipate when the seals lift their head out of the water to breathe, not looking down. At that point, the shark launches a brief vertical attack, and in just a few tail beats, rushes to the surface, totally knocking the seal in its jaws. They build up enough speed, over 35 miles an hour, that they hit the seal with such force at the surface that it incapacitates the seal, fatal on the first strike. It's over in seconds.
The science team is studying shark attack data to understand how and why these beasts are attacking man more often. The analysis seems to indicate 4 distinct types of attack.
Predatory attacks by white sharks are very violent, very high energy. Usually, the victims of predatory attacks do not survive. They are meant to immobilize and/or kill the prey on initial contact. This minimizes injury to the shark.
The predatory attack is the most likely to result in death to its victim.
Generally, it's a single bite, then the shark will back away and then come in at its leisure to finish off the prey.
These types of attacks are for feeding. An example of a predatory attack occurred in 1981 near Pebble Beach, California.
And it was a massive animal. A young man went surfing alone in Monterey Bay. The next day, two young men walking along the beach found a surfboard with a large bite removed from it. 2 days later, Louis Boren's body washed ashore. He had been struck one time. The configuration of the wound, its location, immediately told us that it was predatory because the shark in a single bite had removed all of the tissue and organs that from under his armpit into the center of his chest, the sternum, and down and out over the top of the hip. So the shark had removed that entire section of Louis Boren's body in a single bite.
Measuring the size of the bite revealed just how monstrous this great white was.
And it was over 20 feet.
The second type of great white behavior is far more frightening and grisly. They are called practice attacks and appear to be done simply to perfect the act of killing.
Whether or not these are attacks where the shark has decided after killing the animal it didn't want to feed, whether these attacks are the result of a reflexive response where the shark sees the seal and simply strikes it as a natural reaction, we don't know. What we do know is that decapitated seals, and a substantial number, washed ashore this year along the California coast, and that tells us that we had more activity from white sharks with these animals.
The third type of attack, known as an investigative bite and release, is by far the most common.
White sharks are a very curious apex predator. Anything at the surface is subject to their investigation. In the case of investigatory attacks by white sharks, those have been perpetrated against all types of ocean user groups. Swimmers, divers, kayakers. That's when the shark isn't sure what the object is, and it circles and it will come in, and eventually it takes a very light nibble of the object. The shark isn't biting the kayak and the surfer because it thinks it's a marine mammal. It's biting that because it isn't sure what it is. This is their way of testing. Generally, when a human is involved, it will be one quick bite, the shark releases the victim and swims away.
The fourth type of shark attack is a defensive or territorial attack.
In the case of David Martin, it would appear that that attack was not predatory, that it was probably some form of threat, territorial displacement behavior by the shark. In the case of a territorial attack, the individual invades the shark's space. The space could be a specific location that the shark is using, possibly for feeding or pupping. And if you invade that area, the shark is going to try to drive you.
His uncle and Troy was out swimming in the afternoon with a Walter Stiles, and they were off of Hollywood Beach in Mattapoisett, and around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a shark appeared right next to Troy and grabbed him by his left leg, pulled him under. Stiles kept diving down trying to get Troy, but he couldn't. But Troy popped to the surface in a big pool of blood. When they got him ashore, they shipped him off, and he went to St. Luke's Hospital, and they ended up amputating his leg, and he passed away. Troy, he was 16 years old.
In the mid-70s, after the release of Jaws,
Another fatal attack in 1936 would cement the monster's fearsome reputation.
Joseph Troy was a boy from Dorchester. He went down to Mattapoisett, and he was visiting.
Today, the shark population is rebounding, and these beasts may be returning to coastlines and public beaches.
What I remember the most is that big eye.
Joe Fitzback, a
deaths of 4 people and the amputation of the survivors' left leg.
The attacks ended shortly after a great white was killed, with human remains in its belly. The panic that ensued during those 2 weeks would later inspire the movie Jaws.
White shark's population was decimated in